Welcome, Peter Kornbluh, to the JFK Facts podcast with a lot to talk about with the release of JFK files under President Trump's executive order in March. The National Security Archive did an excellent selection of documents, and that's really where I'd like to start with, kind of what did you learn from this release of documents?
Well, Jefferson Morley, I just want to say, I've been waiting for years to be on a podcast with you. I remember decades ago you being my hero when you wrote a review of a Bruce Springsteen album for the New Republic, I think.
Yeah. Let's look that one up, folks. New Republic, 1980
80 something, 84, 85?
86, yeah.
The Born in the USA album, perhaps.
He did a big live album at that time. Fans, excuse the digression to Bruce Springsteen. Peter and I go back. We will get to JFK records in a minute. But it's important because, first of all, we've known each other for a long time, and we've been covering the CIA for a long time too. So it's relevant somehow.
In the old days, you were my editor at the Nation and the Washington Post. So anyway, this is a long way of saying thank you for inviting me on. I know you know these documents really well, even better than I do. But the fact that we have an unredacted history that has, by quirks and circumstances, rolled out of this special JFK Assassinations Records Act, many documents really not having anything to do at all with the assassination itself. In fact, the vast majority of them not having anything to do with the assassination, but still giving us a history that we never would have gotten otherwise, except for this law. And as I like to say, the JFK Records Act is the historical gift that keeps on giving. And now it's kind of given its final, tranches of documents. I know you're still after some more, but and we now really have a full history of some of the CIA operations in various parts of the world, particularly Cuba, where I've spent decades analyzing and studying U.S.-Cuban relations. So these are incredible documents. It's the one and only place really where people can have access to an uncensored, unredacted history of these kinds of clandestine activities.
Yeah, really remarkable, the detail that you see in the operational detail that we don't really see anywhere else in CIA history. Maybe a little bit in the Iran-Contra affair, where clandestine activities were exposed, but really the detail that we get from this. And I should say, for listeners, Peter is the author of an excellent book about Cuba during the Kennedy years and after, Back Channel to Cuba, which is a kind of history of the efforts of the United States and Cuba to deal with each other over the last 60, 75 years. Anyway, very important book for this period. So we get these things, these documents that had been withheld. I had been calling attention to the Arthur Schlesinger memo, which had a huge redaction in it. And you brought a little bit more to bear on this story in a piece for Responsible Statecraft. It really put the Schlesinger memo in context. People have always heard, I think a lot of people have heard that phrase, Kennedy wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter to the winds. So what did happen? And how did Schlesinger's memo fit into Kennedy's thoughts about the CIA early on in his presidency?
Well, this was the document that, because of your work, I think every media outlet went to first when the final JFK papers were released. You had a special interest in that section, and you shared that in advance. And so everybody else decided that was an interesting place to start. And it was dramatic. You had a whole page and a half that had been blacked out for more than 50 years. And then suddenly it was completely clear and you could read it. And it was about a part of CIA history that people didn't really know, which was the details of controlled American sources, CAS, the actual undercover CIA operatives in diplomatic posts, posing as political officers and consulate officers and economic officers and agricultural officers, et cetera. And it turns out that according to Schlesinger's memo, basically half of all the diplomatic postings around the world were actually CIA officers rather than actual diplomats, 47%, almost 50%.
And
And in some posts,
did that number surprise you?
absolutely. I mean, one understood that the CIA used embassies for cover, and particularly the designation of political officer. But the fact that, in some embassies, there were more CIA officers than actual diplomats, and that around the world, it was almost 50%, is just astounding, if not, I have to say, appalling. And I think that it was appalling to Arthur Schlesinger back in the early 60s, where he firmly believed that, the State Department should be in charge of US diplomacy around the world. And yet in so many embassies, you had CIA officers, including the station chief, who often had more access, more power than the ambassador himself, and were doing different things than the ambassador might have wanted, with no obligation to even tell the ambassador what they were doing.
Yeah.
And so,
No,
so this was,
when Win Scott was station chief in Mexico City, the Mexicans called the CIA station the real embassy. And
absolutely,
that is
yes.
who they preferred to deal with it. But even, yeah, if you'd asked me, I would have said, maybe a quarter were CIA. I felt like I knew what was going on. When it was close to 50%, it was like you say, who was inclined to be suspicious of the CIA, actually dramatically underestimated the scope of their influence.
Well, how is it that all these decades later, after the CIA was created, and with all the focus and attention on the CIA, including the extraordinary books that you have written, and the research that's been done, and the declassified documents that we've gotten over the years, that only now are we learning these basic facts of how far the tentacles of the CIA extended, not only around the world, but even through the avenues and routes of U.S. government activity. And so the real kind of headline for me coming out of that release of JFK documents in March was, the fact that CIA clandestine reach and clandestine operations were far more extensive than previously understood. And we are learning the basic details. And even though many of these documents have been out before, key words in them and key paragraphs, as in the case of the Schlesinger memo, have been withheld all this time as a secret of state. I'm not sure that your listeners fully are aware that the CIA managed to get itself an exemption for operational documents back in the early 1980s, a law that said they didn't even have to look if someone like Peter Kornbluh from the National Security Archive or Jefferson Morley did a Freedom of Information request for operational documents. So the CIA protected itself, but it couldn't protect itself in the end from this law, JFK Assassinations Record Act, which said that everything had to be declassified, in part to end the secrecy around the issue of the Kennedy assassination and show, what was there and to show what wasn't there too.
Right.
So that's how come we have these documents now in unredacted form, and they've told us a lot. So
Another set of documents that drew a lot of comments were the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Kind of a little chorus on the side to look at intelligence issues for the president. What you talk about, Schlesinger's proposing this radical reorganization or reorganization of the CIA to put it under State Department control. Kennedy thinks about it. Do we know how Kennedy responded to the memo, or, because we know he didn't pursue it, right? He didn't pursue reorganization of the CIA, at least in the way Schlesinger was proposing it. So what happened after Schlesinger wrote his memo?
let me just say, I hope that people will go to Responsible Statecraft and read this article that I wrote there about the Schlesinger memos. There were
Yeah.
actually two. The first one was written a month before the one that you focused on.
Mm.
And it was about the same topic, but it focused on the British intelligence system and how it was subordinated to the British Foreign Ministry. But in the last third or so of that first memo, Schlesinger basically went into a long assessment of why the CIA not being under control of the State Department and the White House was very, very bad for the conduct of US policy, why the Bay of Pigs was going to be repeated again and again and again if Kennedy didn't do something, and why it was now time to break the CIA up, and even proposed a series of new names for the CIA, which were remarkable. And that was the first memo. It was dated, I think, in July of 1961, and then the second one was dated. I'm sorry, the first one was dated in May of 1961, and then the second one was dated in June of 1961. The CIA reorganization.
Yeah.
And these are all, and frankly, it's a misnomer. It's. I think it's wrong to say that Schlesinger came up with this idea. Kennedy tasked him to do this.
That's an important point to make. Yeah.
And that is in the very first sentence of the first memo, which is not part of the JFK papers. The very first sentence is, "You tasked me to go look at the British system and how they handle their intelligence service and its relationship to the rest of the British government." And so he had done that. He had actually gone to Europe, met with a bunch of people in London, gone to other European countries as well, and then come back and written this memo. And the memo is very harsh.
It's important to note, people may not know, Arthur Schlesinger was in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. And so, which was very much the product of the training of the British intelligence service. The OSS officers, in order to get up to speed, were basically trained by the British because they had the experience. So Schlesinger had even, understood the system, not just, he wasn't just, he had lived it. It wasn't just something he was studying.
And many people think that the key issue here was the fact that the CIA had both intelligence gathering and covert operations responsibilities together, whereas in the British system that was broken up. Intelligence assessments were done in the foreign ministry. But Schlesinger pointed out very strongly that that wasn't the issue. The issue was the fact that the British intelligence system was under the control of the foreign ministry. It was not operating separately from the foreign ministry, like the CIA was operating separately from the State Department. And so that is really the broader context. The truth is, Kennedy considered reorganizing the CIA. He was so upset with what had happened at the Bay of Pigs. And he tasked Schlesinger to provide him some arguments about this and some alternative models. And then, and we didn't really understand this before, he also tasked his PIFIAB, his Presidential Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, to hold some hearings about this, make some recommendations to him. And all of that has come out in these JFK papers, and it's a small juncture of CIA covert operations history in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs that's quite intriguing and has never really been, I think, fleshed out.
A couple of people have noted that to me, and we're going to run an article on JFK Facts about the PIFIAB minutes. So do you
Which, by the way, I want to say, we did a whole posting. The second posting we did, the third posting we did at my organization was all those PIFIAB papers.
Right.
So I hope that you can link to that.
We're using that, but developing a theme that I think you're talking about, which was this was an avenue or a channel for Kennedy to push gently, I guess, or behind the scenes or quietly, his ideas about reforming the CIA. Is that a fair? Is that what you see in the new PIFIAB documents?
Well, he went into the PIFIAB meetings himself, which is a
Yeah.
rare thing. The president didn't always attend these meetings, but he went in a few weeks after the Bay of Pigs debacle,
Mhm.
and basically read the riot act to the CIA officers that were there and the PIFIAB people, which is, how is it that the CIA isn't under control here, and
Right.
who the hell knows what the CIA is doing, and and how are we going to apply lessons from this, disaster at the Bay of Pigs. And, he raised some issues there about changes, but I think it was in that moment that he basically, although it's not actually in the minutes itself of these documents, that he suggested to the PIFIA people that they at least explore what CIA reorganization would look like. And I think it's important to note, this really was in some ways a very small moment of time. I think we're talking about 3 months,
Right.
perhaps. I would just say one other thing, though. By the end of 1961, the CIA's own Inspector General, Lyman Kirkpatrick, had done a very thorough and very condemnatory 100-page assessment of the CIA's own responsibility for the Bay of Pigs. He didn't blame the president. He didn't blame the military. He blamed the CIA itself. And that document was so explosive that John McCone gathered the 20 copies of it that there were that had been distributed, destroyed almost all of them, and put the last several in a safe where they stayed for about 35 years before I came along and filed a Free Information Act and really pressed through the law to get this, what I call the holy grail of the Bay of Pigs, declassified. And of course, they kept it that secret because they were worried that it would provide fuel to this very issue of CIA reorganization if it landed in the wrong hands.
Mhm. Um, People should know Lyman Kirkpatrick had been a top official in the CIA. This was an insider criticizing the agency. This wasn't an outsider, right?
Yes, he was a veteran, lifelong CIA officer. He was really expected, I think, to become director at some point.
Yeah.
He actually had a disability, some type of paralysis, if I recall, and was in
I
a
think he had
wheelchair.
polio.
Polio, and that, I think, kind of his physical limitations, I think, worked against him.
Uh-huh.
And afterwards, his enemies in the CIA would blame his bitterness about not becoming CIA director for, his tough stance on the Bay of Pigs. But he told it like it was.
Right. Um, so Kennedy gets this strong recommendation. He has strong feelings, but ultimately he does nothing. Do we have any sense of, was that a decision or was that just inertia? It was just too much to try and do? Uh,
It would be a lot.
yeah.
Here you had a young president. His reputation had really been hurt by what had happened at the Bay of Pigs in the first weeks of his youthful, energetic administration. To start to dismantle the CIA, I mean, he would have faced the same pressures that he faced to greenlight the Bay of Pigs to begin with.
Right.
Veteran intelligence officers saying to him, "No, you shouldn't do this. This will create a period of instability. Our enemies will take advantage of it." All these things, and so. Plus, he almost immediately moved to launch a whole new set of operations against Cuba and elsewhere. And he took an interim step. To gain control over at least Cuba covert operations, he appointed his own brother, who was Attorney General of the United States. The guy who's supposed to uphold the laws of the United States now becomes a quasi-CIA director for a niche of covert operations against Cuba, all in violation of international law and every conceivable ethical and moral stricture that we know. So that was the first step that Kennedy took to rectify this. He got rid of Alan Dulles as director, and he eventually got rid of Richard Bissell as deputy director of plans of covert operations, holding them both responsible for the Bay of Pigs. and he did not go forward with either Arthur Schlesinger's recommendations or the PIFIAB recommendations, basically. Um, uh, uh, and it was more tweaking in
Yeah.
terms of kind of control and oversight, kind of insider oversight, than any significant reorganization.
Do you
Yeah.
think Kennedy might have contemplated that in a second term?
Well, it's hard to know. Fairly quickly, as all this was evolving and playing out and being debated, the Cuban Missile Crisis developed.
Right.
Within 12 months, or 15 months, 16 months or so. And so you had, and of course the CIA actually turned out to be correct. They had early intelligence about these missiles. John McCone was in there telling Kennedy very early on in the
Right.
summer of 1962 that there were missiles coming to Cuba. And it just, the world was so dramatic and so ongoing that to pause the much needed work of the intelligence community and covert operations community at that point was difficult.
Yeah.
But the truth is we don't know a lot about this incredible episode, and it was fun to learn more about it. I have to tell you, Jeff, I have wanted to write that piece in Responsible Statecraft for more than 25 years. Maybe even closer to 40 years. It was about 38, 39 years ago, maybe, that I read Schlesinger's memoir, 1,000 Days. And in that memoir, he had like 2 sentences, which basically said, in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, the State Department wanted to break up the CIA's functions and rename the agency. And so he put it all on the State Department, when in fact it was his recommendation, not the State Department, about
Right.
breaking it up and renaming the agency. So I've always been curious about that, and I'm glad we know more about it. And let's be frank, we know more about it because the JFK Assassinations Records Act has allowed us to access these incredible documents. I mean, we should have had access to these documents decades ago. This is our history. We paid for all of this. The American public deserves to know what was done in its name, but without its knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, and by law, all of this should have been made public 8 years ago.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Did you see anything that like couldn't have been released 8 years ago? In reading through these documents, like, oh, that would have been a problem. I mean, I haven't seen anything like that.
I think it's important for everybody to realize that the world hasn't fallen apart in the 2 months that since the lid has been lifted on CIA covert operations in Mexico and Chile and Cuba. The fact that we were breaking into the French embassy in the early 60s with the Kennedy's authorization. None of this has exploded or ended the world. The world has, history is history, and the world has a lot of current problems to deal with. So the basic argument that the CIA has made all these years about how this release of names and places would compromise its ability to recruit people in the future and use embassy cover and all those things has been, malarkey for a long time. I have to say, I think there are certain names that were included of assets and collaborators that, I have sensitivities to their families and their countries. And if it was up to me, I probably would have continued to redact those names unless they had been fully published before and then the kind of immediate family was deceased, et cetera. And you could see 1 or 2 operations that certainly, could cause a ruckus.
Right.
But and of course, the social security numbers and all the privacy information should have been withheld.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual operations and what countries are collaborating in how they were run, this is covert operations history. It's not about today's world. It's about the deep past, and we should know it.
Yeah. Um, so let's pick up at the Cuban Missile Crisis. I want to get to, I know these documents weren't out, but I see this as the backdrop to the events of 1963. And that's the back channel to Cuba, the title of your book, which is not just about the Kennedy years, but about many decades of US-Cuba relations. But what does Kennedy do in terms of what's he thinking in 1963 after the missile crisis about how to deal with Cuba?
Well, it's super interesting. We have the CIA's response to the Cuban Missile Crisis and how it was going to plan to expand its operations and reconfigure its operations against Cuba. And then we have a whole series of events that we know separately from various other research that some of us have done into the Kennedy era, that John F. Kennedy himself was quite chastened by how close the world had come to Armageddon during the missile crisis. And he, unbeknownst to most people, was extremely committed to some kind of diplomatic resolution of that, and really launched 3 initiatives during the missile crisis that most people weren't aware of. He actually had a message sent to Fidel Castro through the Brazilian government, basically saying, if you kick the Russians out, we'll find a way to coexist with your revolution. He then had twice the messages sent to the head of the United Nations, U Thant, to say, if you propose a swap of our missiles in Turkey for the missiles in Cuba, which I cannot publicly propose for political reasons, I will agree publicly to your proposal. And then on that same issue, secretly, he sent his brother to make that same proposal secretly, top secretly, to the Russians, to the Soviets, take those missiles out of Cuba now, and you just have the president's word that 6 months from now we'll start to dismantle our missiles in Turkey, the Jupiter missiles. So he was very committed to diplomacy, and then you see that commitment extend after the crisis is resolved with the missiles into early 1963, where he starts to decide, we really don't need this conflict with Cuba. We really don't need Cuba to feel like it has to be defended by the Soviet Union, and we don't need to do this again. So let's figure out a way to communicate with Castro. So he's, a whole series of emissaries with Kennedy's authorization go throughout 1963 to Havana with one message or another. This history as well as I do, but if anybody wants to read it, it's in Back Channel to Cuba in very dramatic form.
Yeah. So, it is a fascinating story. But what's interesting is, so this is happening in the spring of 1963. At the same time, like you said, CIA is expanding operations. Kennedy's not is he reining that in? Is he supporting that? I mean, from another lens, people say, oh, Kennedy was a hawk. He was trying to kill Castro. That wasn't, the back channel wasn't serious, or there was something equally serious going on in the other direction.
Well,
How do we
I
sort
can
that out?
certainly tell you. I can certainly tell you as one of the foremost researchers of Kennedy and Cuba, and Kennedy and the efforts to reach out to Castro in 1963, that it certainly was serious. At the same time, some CIA operations did continue, although if you look at them carefully, they somewhat cut back. And then the United States did this switch. Kennedy kind of tried to end hands-on control of these exile groups and turned to this program called autonomous activity, where we would basically send these guys off to Honduras and Nicaragua, give the governments there some support for supporting these exiles, and let the exiles do what the hell they wanted without our direct support, so that we wouldn't be responsible for them. They wouldn't be our headache, and et cetera. And presumably they would do less
Right.
on their own. And Operation Mongoose eventually, was cut back, and et cetera. So I had that same question that you've posed, covert operations still going on, but Kennedy trying to pursue some type of peace track, olive branch with the Cubans. And for the book, for Back Channel to Cuba, I was able to interview McGeorge Bundy, who was Kennedy's national security advisor at the time. And I asked him that very question. What does this mean that, you were pursuing autonomous operations and you still had part of Operation Mongoose, and yet here Kennedy was seriously interested in some type of communication and dialogue with Castro. And Bundy was very simple. The president was into multitasking, and he believed in kind of trying what there was, and through these negotiations to free the Bay of Pigs prisoners that James Donovan, the New York lawyer, had conducted, it became clear that there was a confidant to Castro. Donovan had gained Castro's trust, and Kennedy wanted to see what was possible. And that was what Bundy said. Kennedy wanted to see what was possible. Was it possible to woo Castro and the Cuban Revolution back into the Western orbit? Bundy had a top aide named Gordon Chase, who was writing all sorts of memos saying exactly this. The missile crisis was a breach between Castro and the Soviet Union. By pulling those missiles out of Cuba without even telling Castro, after Castro had basically been willing to sacrifice his country for the Soviet Union and face the onslaught of a U.S. attack or obliteration by U.S. bombs, the insult to Castro was so much that there was this breach with him and his patron, and the United States should try and say, you know what? If you steer clear of the Soviets and stop screwing around with revolution in the rest of Latin America and the Third World, we'll accept peaceful coexistence with the Cuban Revolution. And so that really was what was on the table for most of 1963.
But super confidential.
Very secret for a variety of reasons. Obviously politically sensitive, obviously difficult politically as 1964, an election year, approached, with Barry Goldwater, an arch anti-communist, threatening to run as the Republican candidate. Obviously very sensitive because, and I think this is what you want to talk about, the CIA opposed this. The CIA did know about these initiatives. And in fact, one of the key kind of outreach to Castro was to get CIA officers who'd been arrested in Cuba and were in Cuban prisons released.
Right.
And Donovan, in April of 1963, negotiated that release without ever telling Fidel who the three real individuals that he wanted were. He basically said, please, what would it take to release all of the Americans, all 23 Americans that are in your jails? And he didn't say, by the way, 3 of whom are bona fide, CIA agents.
Can I tell you one story about that?
Yeah, there's some documents that have been released on that in the JFK papers.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
So one of the CIA wanted to spring those guys, and they called in none other than James McCord from the Office of Security, and they got the plans to the prison. And they were planning a jailbreak. They were planning to spring those, like a commando attack, to go in and do that. And McCord was in charge of coming up with that. And then those plans were in development when Donovan made the deal, and there was no need for the raid.
Right. Well, and of course, you remember the extraordinary twists of history with Donovan making that deal. Here, for one big part of the CIA, he is representing them to get their guys back. But then there's a little faction ZR Rifle, the special squad that's in charge of assassinating Castro. And they figure, oh my God, we've got this guy who's going to actually meet with Castro. Well, let's just give him, a poisoned scuba diving suit and scuba diving gear, so that he, we can use him as basically an indirect assassin.
Uh-huh.
You had the CIA guy who was helping Donovan with these negotiations, basically holding off the assassinos, the assassin squad, from using him to assassinate
Did they ever
Castro.
give him the scuba diving suit or the
So
explosive
what
propellant?
happened is that Donovan had bought the scuba diving gear already, the suit, at Abercrombie and Hutch. What's it? Abercrombie and
Fitch.
Fitch, yes. And so the suit was already there in a box. The CIA, Technical Services Division, TSD, made up a doctored suit where they put the poison, the fungus in the mouthpiece and the chemicals in the suit, and they put it in a different box. And they were going to switch the box, but Donovan's kind of handler inside the CIA just got wind of this, and he just kept control of the original suit, to scuba diving suit,
The
to make sure,
non-poisonous suit.
right, the non-poisonous suit. I mean, but geez, you can't make this stuff up. It's so incredible. But
Yeah.
yeah, this is an amazing history. The CIA is in the middle of it. Of course, they wanted to use Donovan for that, but then Donovan comes back from that April trip where he gets these CIA guys released, but he comes back with this extraordinary report. He has sat down with Castro. Castro has said to him, now that we've negotiated the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners and now the release of these Americans, isn't there a way for us to bridge all this, the horrendous history, the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis, and, find common ground? And Donovan tells Fidel Castro, he asks him, Mr. Premier, do you know how porcupines make love? And Castro has to ask his interpreter, to interpret this, and finally says, no, I don't know how they make love. And Donovan says, very carefully. And this is how you and the United States will find the common ground and come together and normalize relations. And so you actually have Donovan coming back at that moment with this, and really positive report in a way. Castro is seriously interested in better relations with the United States now that we've cleared out all this prisoner exchange stuff.
And he sends that message through other channels, through Lisa Howard, the ABC newswoman.
Well, she was pursuing this on her own.
Uh-huh.
She was also in Cuba in April of 1963 trying to interview Castro, and eventually she gets Donovan to make an introduction for her. He tells Castro that there's a beautiful blonde dish of a reporter who wants to talk to him. And she then takes the baton of normalization and being an interlocutor between Havana and Washington from Donovan, who kind of steps aside. His mission is over. He wants to run for senator from New York. Robert Kennedy wants to run for senator from New York, so they come into conflict. But Lisa Howard picks up that baton of normalization and runs with it, all summer long, trying to convince the Kennedy people, and then all the way through to the day of the assassination, where yet a third intermediary, Jean Daniel, enters the picture as well.
So what you're saying is Kennedy was very serious about rapprochement with Cuba in 1963. It was,
he was serious. There's no two ways about it. He was serious. The CIA was extremely uncomfortable with this. Their whole kind of institutional reason for being in the Western Hemisphere was to fight Castro. And so there was that tension, to be sure. all of this ends with the all of this is culminating in November of 1963, and of course ends with an assassination's bullet.
Right. So, I mean, I know you disagree, but I see, policy opposition to Kennedy's policies, especially in Cuba, as a factor, as a cause of the assassination. I know you don't want to talk about that, and we don't have to debate that. I think this background is really essential for anybody who wants to understand the assassination and the events of 1963. Um, what do you make of that? Or have you decided these events are not connected in your own mind? Or
I truly think they're connected in a different way than
okay.
you do. And I think that there are some interesting papers from the Kennedy Assassination Records Act that have been released before this final release. I haven't checked to see if they were ever redacted before, but there was a whole later assessment by the CIA about Oswald's motivations, and they thought that perhaps he had read about the Operation Mongoose assassination attempts against Castro, and that some of that had appeared in the New Orleans papers. I know you're very familiar with those documents, but I think for me, Oswald was not some Looney Tune who simply, decided to kill the president one day. I think he had some politics, and he wanted to get back to Cuba, and he thought perhaps by killing the president he would be helping Fidel Castro avoid being assassinated by the Kennedy assassination. And for me, the great irony of the Kennedy assassination, focusing solely on Oswald and his potential motivations for doing what he did, was that he aborted at the very moment that it was climaxing this effort to improve and normalize relations between the two countries. Not only did Lisa Howard set up an agreement between the two countries for a very high level meeting to take place after Kennedy got back from Dallas, but John Daniel was literally sitting with Fidel Castro carrying a message of peace from the president of the United States when they heard from the radio that Kennedy had been assassinated. So it's one of these extraordinary turning points and what ifs in the history of U.S.-Cuban relations. That's the way I see it. And,
No. So I mean, I would just say, to me, it seems more plausible that the assassination was the work of Kennedy's enemies than it was the work of Oswald, who the forensic evidence against him is extraordinarily weak and getting weaker. Um, but let's put that aside. And the Kennedy assassination is a turning point. The idea of reorganizing the CIA that Kennedy is pushing, that there's some force to it, there's some momentum behind it, there's some planning going on, that really dies in Dallas, right? Nobody continues that idea of maybe we need to reorganize the CIA.
Look, I mean, I don't really want to enter into a debate over all of this, but I understand, where you're going with that. And I would just point out that the timetable doesn't really work. As I said, it was a fixed 2 or 3 month discussion about reorganizing the CIA, and then it goes away. I mean, it stops really being discussed. Kennedy moves to make some bureaucratic changes, including firing Dulles and firing Bissell and appointing his brother. Events, he authorizes Operation Mongoose, a whole big effort, again, to undermine and overthrow Castro, and rejects, by the way, normalization talks with the Cubans, that Richard Goodwin has come back in August of 1961 after meeting with Che Guevara to suggest. That gets rejected. So, and then, quite a bit of time goes by before the assassination, when you have, close to 2 years almost that this is not an issue anymore.
No,
So,
no. The issue is Kennedy doesn't want to overthrow Castro. The issue isn't the CIA is going to be reorganized. The issue is this guy's not with the program. I mean, and I remember the memos that McCone and Helms exchange after Lisa Howard comes back. It's like, oh my God, the president might take this seriously. We've got to get rid of this idea, So to me, the CIA is mobilizing in early 63 against any suggestion of normalization, which would be anathema to the CIA. And at the same time, I mean, now we're going to get into it. At the same time, we see all these CIA operations converging on this so-called, misnamed lone nut who was actually quite well known to top CIA officials. But let's not, I know you don't want to debate the assassination. We can, my point is, I feel like after Kennedy's assassination and after there was no real investigation of it, no serious investigation of all the CIA's role, that they kind of had impunity after that. I think this was kind of the point of your responsible statecraft article. If Kennedy had reorganized the CIA, a lot of what later happened might not have happened in terms of covert action, regime change, scandals, Iran-Contra.
I mean, there's been a CIA scandal related to unethical and illegal and covert operations almost every 5 years
Right.
since 1961, going all the way into the 1980s and Iran-Contra and Chile, Iran-Contra, you name it. So and CIA history obviously would have been different if John F. Kennedy had acted on his inclination and reorganized our intelligence services as as a pursuant to the British system, for example, where the diplomats would have been far more in control, and civil society would have been far more in control of covert operations, and they would have fit into policy. This isn't to suggest. I think that Arthur Schlesinger, his perspective is the CIA is a rogue actor. Nobody was controlling it. They're out there on their own. I mean, the truth is that you look at most everything that the CIA did, Kennedy, authorized. And that's been the way it is about most covert operations. It's not that the CIA has acted independently. Yes, many things and many exercises of power on the ground, the whole business of the CIA station chief being an ambassador in his own right, sure, that's not controlled by the president or by the State Department. And those are real things. But in terms of the big covert operations that have shamed and scandalized the United States, the American public, and the world, most of those were authorized by whatever president was in power at the time. The CIA didn't do Iran-Contra on its own. All of that came through the White House. So, and you've seen many instances where the agency became concerned that they were going to end up being blamed for something and demanded, that there be some kind of formal approval. So, but I think what's important is that we have the history.
Exactly.
That is something that people really should realize. I can't say this more clearly. The CIA hoped to have these secrets kept secret for eternity, that there would never be a time that you and I would be able to discuss the names of agents, the 15 other countries that were working with the CIA on Cuba, how much the CIA spent on Cuba versus how much they spent in other Latin American countries, how many agents and officers and staffers they had working on Cuba operations, what they were doing in Chile, in Brazil, in the overthrow of Cheddi Jagan in British Guiana. I mean, all these things we would not be able to discuss with
And
full knowledge, if the CIA had had its way, and the Kennedy Assassinations Records Act changed that. And it's an act that should be a model for other laws directed at other collections of documents.
yeah,
And that's the
yeah,
only way we're going to have access to our own history.
yeah, absolutely. And I might add, President Biden approved of the CIA's plans to keep these things secret forever. It was only Trump's executive order that kind of overrode the last objections of the CIA and pushed all of this stuff into the public record. Um,
Well, Trump himself also made the same agreement with the CIA back in 2017, when you and I both had hopes that finally the documents are going to be released. And it's not, I have to say, some of those arguments have merits. You have sensitive relations going on with Mexico, and someone comes in and says, "Well, we're going to release all these documents that literally show that the CIA had 3 Mexican presidents basically in its pocket, uh, and that the biggest espionage and most secret and successful espionage program was run in Mexico City out of the office of the president of Mexico." That is, you think to yourself, well, we don't want to disturb U.S.-Mexican relations right now because we want to work on counter narcotics and we want to work on immigration, et cetera. And you think, well, what's more important, counter narcotics and immigration, or, some old secret? So you can understand why, sometimes these decisions are made. But, now we have the documents. Nothing's changed, and this can be a model, I think, for future declassifications.
yeah, absolutely. You know, we have um, you have similar controversies now around UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, origins of COVID, um, and the secrecy around these issues is what drives the conspiracy theories. And why do we need to have secrecy around unexplained aerial phenomenon? It's like it's a scientific question. Why shouldn't information circulate widely, you know?
But let me, but it's, I mean, this is so interesting, Jeff, and you know it better than anybody because you wrote a great book on the CIA station in Mexico. But the secrecy surrounding Oswald in Mexico and CIA and Oswald in Mexico had to do with covering up and keeping secret that big espionage, Operation Leon Voy,
Yeah,
um, which was the code name for this incredible wiretapping, phone tapping, communications interception operation that the CIA was running in Mexico, and did not want to compromise, even to help the American public understand what had happened in the Kennedy assassination.
right.
And so a lot of secrecy there. The same thing with UFOs.
Yeah.
The secrecy around UFOs dates back to the 1950s, when, CIA satellites started to fall from the sky, and they didn't want the Soviets to know what those satellites were. They didn't want the American public and Congress to know what those satellites were. So they, would go and they would, in the darkness, they would extricate all that equipment and they would seal off that area. And the conspiracy theory started, this was an alien spaceship that fell, and they're keeping this secret from us. And can I just tell you, there's an internal CIA history of how the agency realized that this was a great opportunity. If we can provide fuel for the fire of the conspiracy theories that are focusing on alien aircraft and aliens, and divert their attention away from the fact that these are our satellites that are falling out of the sky, this helps us. And so they set up a whole program, secret program, to fund UFO conspiracy nuts, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a history that a lot of people don't
Uh-huh.
know. From the 50s.
I didn't know that. I mean,
Yeah.
I always thought that the secrecy around it was, ridiculous. And like you say, self-aggrandizing, right? It's an opportunity to increase your budget. Oh, maybe these are secret Soviet weapons that they've never disclosed before, and we can get a weapons program to counter them, that kind of thing.
No, it's that too many unidentified objects in the sky and falling to the ground were actually U.S. intelligence devices that the CIA and the NSA did not want anybody to know about.
Mhm.
And, so, yeah, I mean, our covert operations and intelligence gathering operations have, I think, contributed in an extraordinary corrupting way to the psyche of the American public. And that's what's bad about secrecy. And, that's what the JFK Commission set about trying to resolve when it said, we're going to release so many of these documents and we're going to release them completely uncensored. That was their goal at the time. I don't think their mission was quite completed the way they thought it would be, but
well, I think it will be completed when the full, this full collection is absorbed and we understand the causes of Kennedy's assassination. So, well,
let me ask you, can I ask you a question before we
sure,
go?
please.
You're in touch with the new declassification committee, Congresswoman Luna, and
Yes.
is she going to help you get the documents that you've been after that you would consider closure on this history?
Yes, she is. I've got some meetings this week about exactly that question. Where Congresswoman Luna is seeking JFK records that were not turned over to the JFK Review Board, but are known to be in possession of the CIA. And that's a real test of the president's order, is whether it can flush out, documents that had never been turned over, which, for example, the FBI did. When
Yes.
the FBI got Trump's order, they went and searched again and they found a bunch of records. Turned out a lot of them had been turned over in other form, but they did a good faith search. So will the CIA do the same? That's a question that Luna's hoping to get an answer for. So, yeah.
Well, we would like to see her push for the full declassification of the CIA's family jewels collection.
Yeah, now I wanted to ask you about that because people said, oh, there was stuff in the family jewels that came out, but then other people said, well, the first document is completely redacted in the family jewels. That's true, right?
Yes, there are sections of the family jewels which my organization, the National Security Archive, spent over 15 years in court trying to get declassified. We eventually did get it declassified, but substantively redacted. The JFK papers, however, include a set of FBI documents that kind of fill in a lot of those redacted parts. Because, of course, part of the family jewels is the CIA's collaboration with the FBI on illegal espionage operations and counterintelligence operations in the United States, all of which was illegal. And so the FBI itself wrote a series of reports in the mid-1970s when it learned about the CIA family jewels document, basically going through the FBI sections and writing up what they said. And those were released now as part of the Kennedy papers. And so we've been able to fill in parts of the family jewels that are still redacted, but we just think that she should just order the full declassification or demand a full declassification because, with the Kennedy papers, A, there's a model that shows the world doesn't fall apart if you declassify everything. And B, the FBI documents that have already come out fill in many of those censored parts. So you might as well just release the whole thing.
Where are those FBI reports?
The second posting that my organization did the week after the release of documents is specific to those FBI reports. So you can read them. There's 3 of them. They're very long, but it's right on in our posting, the second posting on the CIA family jewels.
I'm gonna go look at that, and listeners should do that too. That's the National Security Archive at George Washington University, and 2 different reports on documents from the new JFK files, right?
3 Three special postings.
Yeah.
One is kind of a survey of great documents. Two is on these FBI documents and the family jewels. And the third is on the PIFIAB and special group covert operations bureaucracy.
Okay, great. Well, I recommend those to everybody. Thank you, Peter, for taking the time to do this. Want to check out more of Peter's work, National Security Archive at George Washington University, nsarchive.org, or his very fine book, if you're interested in the Kennedy years, especially Back Channel to Cuba. So thank you, Peter.
All right, take care. Best wishes.
Okay. Hey, everybody, I wanted to call your attention to one surefire way to deepen your knowledge of the assassination of President Kennedy. And that's to read my 3 books about the CIA, a trilogy of spies that tells how the assassination actually unfolded in the eyes of CIA insiders. You see, my work on JFK's assassination is rooted not in the literature of conspiracy, but in the history of CIA operations. And that makes all the difference when it comes to understanding the events that culminated on November 22nd, 1963. You'll want to check out my 3 CIA books that tell the story of the founding generation of the Central Intelligence Agency and what 3 insiders actually thought about JFK's assassination. Meet charismatic Station Chief Winston Scott as he surveils Lee Harvey Oswald 6 weeks before Dallas. Meet urbane CIA Director Richard Helms as he fends off President Richard Nixon's attempts to blackmail him over JFK's assassination. Meet James Angleton, the ingenious, paranoid, and sinister counterintelligence chief who had controlled the agency's file on Oswald since 1959. In these books, you'll see the real historical foundation of the events that led to President Kennedy's assassination, and you'll understand this event in a much deeper way. Check out my books at jeffersonmorleybooks.com. You can buy all of these books there, as well as my other nonfiction book, Snowstorm in August. So check out the Trilogy of Spies.